welcome to the Distinguished Lecture, the Regional and Community Planning Distinguished Lecture for 2014 and 2015, part of the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design Distinguished Lecture Series. Today we're going to be hearing from Julie Campoli. As most of you are familiar by now, when Dean DeNoble introduces talks like this, he's fond of quoting his dean, Werner Seligman from Syracuse University, in saying, "Go to lecture or be stupid for the rest of your life." Julie Campoli will offer ample evidence of the wisdom of that suggestion. Julie is an author and an urban designer whose work to an unusual degree illustrates the constitutive qualities of good urban form. She has a master's degree in landscape architecture from Cornell University, has been a member of the teaching faculty at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University. She's a principal of Terra Firma Urban Design based in Burlington, Vermont. Amongst a number of her books include Above and Beyond, Visualizing Change in Small Towns and Rural Areas, the work Visualizing Density, developed with the photographer Alex McLean, and most recently Made for Walking, Neighborhood Density in Urban Form, which I'm sure she'll tell you is available on Amazon and is worth the investment. I'm most excited to hear Julie talk again because we urbanists, professionals, students, lay actors alike, often speak in abstractions and generalities. We talk about sustainability, livability, compact form, and even the best of us often struggle to pin down exactly what those concepts mean. Julie Campoli's work uses innovative graphic techniques to explain the relationship between design concepts and actual urban environments. It enables designers and decision makers and communities to better understand the implications and the consequences of the choices that we make. And I've found that she's one of the most literate urbanists around. So please join me in welcoming her to Manhattan, Kansas.
Thank you, Jason. Can everybody hear me? It's such a pleasure to be here in Manhattan, Kansas, where I've never been before. I'd like to thank the huge team of folks that have been making me feel so welcome and shepherding me around. I've met a lot of students today as well as professors, and I'm convinced that this is a wonderful place indeed, and wish that I had known about it when I was considering going to graduate school in landscape architecture. So it's been great to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to get my reading glasses, actually. Because it won't go well if I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, I am going to talk about walkable cities and illustrate the elements of urban form that make walking possible. And I'm going to talk about why in the United States at this point in time it's so very difficult to achieve that. And then I'm going to really ask you to think more about the simple act of walking. And then really talk about moving around and how we move really affects the environments that we live in. And I'd like to start by turning to Hollywood. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Humphrey Bogart, but he made a lot of movies in the 1940s, film noir movies. And this particular movie, The Big Sleep, was set in Los Angeles in 1947. And a lot of the action takes place in Hollywood. And I was really struck by the fact when I saw it that Philip Marlowe has this upstairs apartment in a downtown location. And a lot of the scenes are shot in these environments that would make any urbanist heart go aflutter. Parking on the street, very narrow streets, local businesses, lots and lots of pedestrians, And it kind of struck me as odd that this is Los Angeles, because it's not the way that I always thought of Los Angeles. And then I saw another movie recently that was filmed in 1952, takes place in Los Angeles. And you know, I always thought, oh, must have been in Paris, but the action actually takes place in Los Angeles. So it's kind of strange to me, because I thought, well, this is just some set designer's idea of what LA looked like. It kind of looked like Paris. But I found some old footage of Los Angeles from 1952, and this is actually what it looked like. Lots and lots of people walking on the street, many, many stores, public transportation. It was a place that you could get around very comfortably without a car. And during that time, cars were available, but they were considered a luxury and not a necessity. And it was a time when people really stepped out. They walked around in fitted suits and tight leather shoes. There wasn't any lycra or sweatshirts or sweatpants, the kind of clothes we wear now, and especially not any sneakers. So people walked a lot, and they walked in very formal dress. So I think that we should be really impressed with our predecessors and their ability to cover pavement on foot. And at the same time, during mid-century America, the nation was captivated by images like this, the glamour of speed, people moving fast and getting to where they want to go in a much speedier, along the open road with the wind in their hair. And advertising had a really powerful hold on the public imagination at that time. And so we were really seduced by this kind of image. And we were told by not just advertisers, but our government and the culture as a whole, that a better world awaited us if we ditched the streetcars and the buses and we all got cars. Then we would be living in kind of a luxurious, sun-dappled paradise. So 50 years later, for 50 years, we spread out, and we did it because we could. We had the means. And first we did it because it was new and different and kind of exciting, and it seemed a lot cheaper to build this way. And we wrote all of the rules of development to favor this kind of land use pattern. And eventually the car, which made it possible, made it absolutely inevitable. And now we find ourselves collectively driving 2.9 trillion miles a year, and it's mostly because we have to. People don't really think that much. The average person doesn't sit around thinking about the relationship between travel and the land use pattern. It's not something that sort of crosses our mind until the price of gas goes up, and that focuses our attention really fast. We look for alternative ways to get around when we can't afford to fill up the gas tank. It's eating up too much of the family budget. And then we discover yet again that most neighborhoods, it's possible to take a walk, but you can't really walk to get anywhere because those destinations are not within walking distance. And as E.B. White wrote so well when he was remarking on the prevalence of cars, he says, everywhere is somewhere else, and you get there in a car. And no one understands this better than people who don't own cars because they can't afford to. On the personal level, you know, we have an emerging sense that there must be a better way to move through our daily lives. And from a larger policy perspective, we have these moments of clarity that, you know, despite the huge investments that we've made in highways, 3 inches of snow in Atlanta can shut down the whole city, and then you end up with hundreds of people sleeping on the floors of supermarket aisles because they can't get home. So we need to change things, and we realize that that kind of change to build a more resilient, sustainable transportation system, that can only come from having a different land use pattern. And then there's the health issue. You know, roughly 80% of the people in this country believe that they should walk more, but they can't take those daily walks. They can't walk to a destination because they're not living near the places that they need to get to. And that has a big impact on children. The rate of kids walking to school a generation ago was so much higher than it is now. It's almost down to nothing. Of the kids that actually live within walking distance of a school, only 8% of them walk because parents are too afraid of letting them walk. They can feel that it's not too safe. And there are a growing number of people that want to move to a place where they can spend more time walking and less time driving, and especially aging baby boomers, the folks that grew up with cars and have lived in the suburbs and dependent on cars most of their lives. They're reaching the point where they're thinking, I don't really want to be living in a place where I have to depend on a car when I'm getting too old to drive. So they're looking for places to retire to. And every time I give a talk, I just turn to the media and there's a story that's, you know, that day or that week that's covering this topics because it's so prevalent. And this one was in 2 days ago in the New York Times about folks just looking for a place where they can live a life that's independent of cars. And then there are young adult children who are really very different than their parents at this point. They are exhibiting completely different housing and transportation preferences than their parents did at the same age. They're really comfortable with density. They're big users of bikes and transit. They like to use technology to aid their use of transit, and they like to ride on buses and subways because they can use their iPhones and they can use their laptops when they're traveling, and they can stay connected through social media. They are not as interested in driving and owning cars, and they have a much lower license rate and driving rate than people like me did a generation ago. And there's mounting evidence that compact walkable cities and towns are really good for us. So many studies now are looking at different aspects of this: environmental, economic, health advantages, and they're finding, you know, lots and lots of reasons to go in this direction. So the question is, you know, what are the elements of a walkable place? You know, where can you live comfortably without driving every day? And some of them are formal elements, and some of them are related to use and function. And one place to look is the research that's been done recently in the last 20 years, looking at that relationship between urban form and travel behavior. And transportation researchers have found that there are 6 basic characteristics of cities that make it, when these elements are present, then people are less likely to drive. They drive fewer miles. There's a lower VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. And the first one is kind of an obvious one, and it's the one that we used to focus on solely, and that's density. It does play a key role. You need to have people living close together to support the services that are within walking distance. So starting with the first density threshold, you need 8 units an acre if you want to have bus service. You can have bus service at the sort of typical American suburban level of 4 units an acre, but you're only going to have, maybe the bus comes by once an hour or once a half an hour, and that has to be heavily subsidized. So if you want to have a real, much more convenient service every 15 minutes, you have to have at least 7 units an acre within a neighborhood to make that worthwhile. Another threshold is 12 units an acre if you want to have a supermarket, a full-service grocery store that has the kind of food that you want to cook for dinner, as opposed to beer and soda and chips. And there are so many neighborhoods that don't have this kind of service in it. So, and a lot of it has to do with density, that the retailers don't want to locate in a place that doesn't have enough customers. So 12 units an acre is necessary for that. If you want to have fixed rail, like light rail or streetcar, you need at least 24 units an acre to provide enough riders to make that viable. So, you know, we used to think that it was everything, but now it's clearly there are other factors involved. Just putting people close together doesn't create the kind of place that's walkable. And a good example of this is this development in Dallas that has a very high density of 64 units an acre. But given the context of where it is, it's a pretty safe bet that people that live there aren't going to be walking anywhere, because it's just surrounded by a sea of asphalt. And there's actually a light rail line there, but it's very difficult to get to that light rail line to take the trip into downtown Dallas. So density alone is not the solution. It's not the amount of density, it's the spatial distribution of that density that really matters. And this is something that I remind communities that are in sort of major battles over density. People kind of get upset when you talk about, you know, higher levels of density. It's important to remember that it's not the number, it's the form. And another factor is diversity, but you could also call this a mix of uses. It's not demographic diversity so much as services, diverse services. And this is a little strip of Queen Street in Toronto, and it's just amazing that the storefronts are so narrow that the kind of variety that you get within a very short distance is amazing. I mean, on this one street, you can buy some paint and buy some plantains and take an art lesson and get a new outfit and send a fax and buy some flowers without walking more than about 150 feet. And here's a couple blocks of the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle. You know, these are just all of the uses that I recorded at a point in time in 2008. I'm sure a lot of them have changed by now, but I bet the number is very similar. And it's just all the kind of things that you need within a normal week of your life. Hair salons, restaurants, dry cleaners, banks, cafes, grocery store, all those types of services that make living in a city really convenient and easy. For the book Made for Walking, I did these analysis of 12 different neighborhoods, and it was interesting to color code the different types of uses to see what kind of range of services was available. Some of the neighborhoods just had mostly cafes and restaurants, some in the more tourist locations. Others had a much wider variety. For example, Brooklyn had a lot of laundromats in that neighborhood. Actually, all over New York, there are a lot of laundromats, but you don't really see those in other cities because it makes sense in a place where the cities are older, the apartments are older, and they're much smaller, and none of them have washing machines in them. But it was interesting also to see how those uses are arrayed. In most older cities, the commercial uses are arrayed along the corridors, the transit lines, or the commercial corridors, the streets that were zoned for commercial. But more recently, other cities are experimenting with a different model. For example, Portland has commercial uses all over this section of town, and as a result, you get much greater convenience because you really don't even have to go more than 1 block or 2 blocks to get your morning coffee or a newspaper or whatever. I guess nobody buys newspapers anymore, that's the sad thing. And then you can add diversity in places that doesn't have an established retail district. This is the City Hall Plaza in San Francisco, and it's kind of empty on most days because there's not a lot of stores around there, but 2 days a week there's a farmer's market, and then the place just kind of fills up with people, and it's a great service to the neighborhood because people can buy fresh produce. So just kind of a temporary retail use is a great opportunity. And also food trucks offer an option to add some services to what is essentially just a parking lot in this case in Portland. And then when those trucks are all parked and serving and open and lined up, it creates this very, very lively streetscape that's entirely temporary and very inexpensive. So another element that makes walking possible is the distance to transit, and making that as short as possible. Because the closer people are to the train or the bus stop, the more likely they are to take a walk or to use that service. If you have a subway line or streetcar line or light rail line running through a district of the city, when you establish those station points, just draw a ring around them, quarter mile, half mile, that's sort of typical walking distance, and make sure that everything within that border is really, really dense so that you can maximize that short distance to transit and you can give as many people as possible that convenience. A great built example of this is this project in Pasadena, California, where they just literally wrapped a very large housing development right around this light rail station. It's probably about 7 stories tall, and has lots of plazas and open spaces. And those plazas are open to the public. You can actually literally walk through the bottom of the building and enter the courtyard where the light rail station is, and there's a restaurant and cafe, so you can spend some time in these beautiful public outdoor environments. So it's kind of giving a lot of people this access to transit and improving the public environment as well. And then there's really simple, inexpensive moves like bike share kiosks placed at transit locations. This is the new streetcar that's being built in Charlotte, North Carolina. Step off the train and you can get on a bike and get to your house. If you don't happen to live right near the train station or the light rail, the streetcar stop, you still have that great access to transit. And then the most important factor that they found is destination accessibility, and that's just kind of another way of saying location, location, location. Just literally putting people next to where they need to go every day is the best way to get people out of their cars. And in Denver, there's a neighborhood called the Highland neighborhood that is about a half a mile from the downtown core where there are a lot of jobs. And there's between those two locations is a river, an interstate highway, and a rail line. Significant barriers. So people were getting in their cars and driving all the way around to get to that spot. So what the city did was just build a series of pedestrian bridges connecting that neighborhood and downtown. And so now it's a very short walk for everyone in that neighborhood to get to their jobs downtown. And the really important thing was not just building the bridge and building those public spaces and the parks that connect them, but was zoning that neighborhood right near the pedestrian bridge for very, very high density so that a lot of people can take advantage of that. And that's where a lot of communities kind of fall short. They put in the infrastructure, but they're just a little too afraid to have the high densities. But that's why Denver is booming so much, because a lot of people want this combination of open space, proximity to jobs, and urban convenience. And then layering multi-story buildings is really important, because if you've got this kind of great retail ground floor going on, you want to have people upstairs that can access that. And the great thing about building up is it takes advantage of our most energy efficient, most safe mode of transportation, which is really the unsung hero of urban transportation, is the elevator. You know, we so overlook this, and it's one of the best ways to travel through space. It's really quiet, it's really fast, and very low impact, and it can be very sociable too. And another way to kind of bring people close to what they need is the old-fashioned corner store, which I'm not sure if that's a tradition in Manhattan, but in the town that I live in, you know, there were corner stores in almost every corner in many of the neighborhoods. And I've actually been very interested in them, and I've started to document the buildings that used to be stores. They were just everywhere, and you can sort of see how they've been rehabbed. You can see where the display windows used to be. And it's a little bit sad, you know, to see this kind of access to groceries that has kind of disappeared in this one city. But a lot of communities are trying to protect those corner stores, and they're writing their regulations to encourage them to stay and to allow new ones to be built. In Austin, they've kind of created this corner store regulations that protects the neighbors with good design buffers, but also allows retail use to go on in essentially a residential segment. Oops. And then, of course, there's design, which is just a really important part of this. It's a really essential element if you want people to walk more, because pedestrians need a whole lot more than a sidewalk. I mean, if you look at this, it's really the buildings and the bank and the stores and the trees and all of those elements that if you take those away, you're left with a place where it's really unlikely that 5 people are going to be standing, chatting comfortably together. It's all the other elements that make the pedestrian experience good, not just the sidewalk. Sidewalk is just the start. Block size really matters. Smaller blocks are better than larger blocks. Of the 12 neighborhoods that I featured in Made for Walking, they ranged in size from 1 acre to 2.5 acres. If you go much bigger than that, it's really hard to develop a walkable pattern, and it mostly has to do with intersection density. You want to have many, many more intersections because that gives the person on foot much more of a variety of choices. You can just go one way, you can go another way. You can take a much more direct route. And it tends to make much smaller streets when you have smaller blocks as well. And then there are places that have larger blocks, and you can kind of retrofit those. In Alexandria, Virginia, this is an infill area, an industrial part of town, and they just kind of were laying out a new street network, and they found that they needed the blocks to be large because they wanted these very large employers to locate there, and the employers were demanding very large floor plates. So they had to make the blocks pretty big. So the way they got around that was they developed this completely separate pedestrian network that threads through those blocks, inside the buildings, through the courtyards, and incorporates a bunch of public plazas. So you can get from one end of this section of town to the other without really even going on a street. You can just take the back routes, the mid-block connections. And then there's a place like Columbus that has an interstate running just north of downtown that cuts the short north neighborhood off from downtown. And what most places would do is just sort of build a sidewalk with maybe a chain link fence along it and call that a connection. But Columbus, had a much more ambitious idea, was to build a little Ponte Vecchio across, which was a bridge that was also a string of shops and restaurants, so that when you go from one end of this to the other, you're just walking along what feels like a very comfortable, it's actually a protected, arcaded city street. So the most walkable streets have a continuous edge with plenty to look at, and you can go inside. There's a possibility of entering. You see people come in and go out, and that creates like the perfect kind of urban edge, as opposed to the way it often gets done. We're getting better at putting buildings up on the street, but if you don't put any entrances onto the street, it just kind of becomes a big blank wall. Or you can have really nice architecture and some nice entrances, but if those storefronts are empty, then there aren't really going to be any people on that street. And it creates something that, when you look at it, just feels kind of dead and not very inviting, because in the end, people just want to be around other people. And one way to get a sense of, what makes a street interesting is to use photography to really look really carefully at what's going on the street. And that's what I did for the Made for Walking project. Just kind of found a street everywhere I went, and with my camera, I just walked down the street, and I just took a photograph every 20 feet. And I kept going until what I saw through my camera lens was no longer interesting. And in a place like Toronto, you could just walk and walk and walk, and what you're seeing is just very interesting. So I went back to my studio, and I just kind of put these all together, stitched them all together with Photoshop, and I found that I was seeing things that I had never seen before. A lot of it has to do with the fact that this is incredibly time-consuming, and you spend hours and hours looking at the photographs. But I just noticed the differences between many of these streets, and they were all really different, even though they had the same basic elements. I noticed that in Lodo, which is a historic section of Denver, the lots are really narrow. So the storefronts are really narrow. So just as in Toronto, you get this incredible variety, not just of stores, but of architecture. And you contrast that with the development that's taking place in the infill area just next to Lodo that has much larger buildings with single owners that own the whole block. You can see that they were making an attempt to make the architecture solid and permanent and high quality, but you don't get that same kind of variety. And that's just a real challenge for us in this day and age of building at a bigger scale. How do you create that kind of variety? Or these two streets in Miami that didn't make it into the book because there just wasn't enough going on there. Either the spaces between the buildings were too large, or the ratio of windows to wall wasn't just right. But to my taste, it wasn't the kind of image that would just kind of say people could feel really sort of excited about. So I urge you to try this. It's not really hard to do if you have a working knowledge of Photoshop. Just do it in the streets of the projects that you're working on, and you'll see all sorts of things that you never saw before. And here's some of the contrast of these different places. And then this little diagram, it's actually 6 feet long when I stitched them all together, of the urban fabric in Brooklyn, where there are no gaps in that fabric. There are no empty lots, there are no parking lots. The buildings just continue on block after block, and there's something very interesting to look at along the way, so it just kind of draws you down the street. And this is what I call, the seamless urban fabric that is so necessary to making a walkable place. And it's exactly like Los Angeles was in the 1940s. And this is a film clip that was made for a movie that was never made. But they just went out on the streets one night with a spotlight and a camera and just drove all around downtown Los Angeles. And as you can see, there's just not a lot of interruption of this fabric. It's just block after block of very nice architecture and active storefronts with lots of people on the street. And this is just a tiny little clip of this film. It's quite astounding, what used to be in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles. And that urban edge, it needs to be connected and continuous, but it doesn't need to be built. It could be something green, like a row of trees with a hedge along the sidewalk, or it could be something as loose and informal as this. It just needs to be interesting, so that you get drawn down that path. So, how do you build a walkable place in the span of 20 years? I think we can look to Portland. They have done an amazing job. Their rail yards looked like this in the 1950s, and by the 1980s, they were pretty much gone, and that land was vacant. They had a lot of unused warehouses and not much going on in this area that's just north of downtown Portland. So what they did was they laid out the street network, and they tied it into the very small block grid that it was part of the downtown that's right next to it, and built up this network with very, very high intersection density. And within that, they threaded this green fingers that left some of those blocks undeveloped and built them as parks and connected them with boulevards. And then they invited developers to build out those full blocks right out to the street with mixed-use buildings that are multi-story, relatively high density, and without any setback, to create that continuous urban edge. And as I said before, they have this diversity of use because they required every developer to put retail on the ground floor, and it creates that incredible convenience. And then they built a streetcar, which is the colored lines that connects this neighborhood to the surrounding city. And now it's a really dense and very popular and very vibrant neighborhood that has filled in the last 15 years. And this is what it looks like. So, everything you need within 15-minute walk of your apartment, a streetcar, bike-friendly streets, lots of open spaces, a great big Safeway supermarket, and people can live there quite happily without getting in a car. So here's the really key point. It's just all about how we move. That's what determines the quality of our urban environments. And if we want to make better cities, then the thing that we need to look at is the relationship between our bodies and the physical world. Walking is one of the first things that we do, and it's what makes us a human being. A baby knows how to walk when it's 6 weeks old, but it hasn't developed the muscles to do it yet. So it spends the first year scooching around and crawling and pulling himself up, and he's striving to get up and walk because that's how he explores his world and learns. And when they first take those first steps, it's the most joyous experience. If you are a parent, you probably remember this. And to the baby, it's just so exciting. And it's because it seems just so extraordinary, when actually it's probably the most ordinary thing in the world. Walking is the most egalitarian of activities, and it's our most basic form of mobility, and it keeps us healthy. But because it's so intrinsic, we really take it for granted, and we tend to dismiss the importance of walking. And I think it's interesting that the second definition for pedestrian is lacking inspiration or excitement, dull. And the synonyms tedious, monotonous, uneventful, unexciting, uninteresting, you know, this is just tells you a lot about our attitude towards walking in the Western world. When you look at Renaissance art, you know, it's the peasant that is always on foot. It's walking is a very humble act. It's done by people that don't have means. And riding is something that is engaged in by the aristocracy. It's if you have money, you can afford a horse or a carriage, and it puts you in an elevated position, a position of power and authority. So as long as humans have been walking, they've been interested in doing more, striving to go faster and striving to go farther. And we had, after horses and chariots, we had our first taste of real speed with the railroad that came on the scene in the 1800s. And there was a lot of excitement about it, but there's also a lot of concern about what this was going to mean to humanity. But it was embraced. And then 100 years later, the car has increased those speeds tremendously, and they have put those speeds in the hands of everybody. So careening through the landscape at a high rate has become a very universal experience, and it's become very normal, and it's how we expect to move around. In a sense, this expectation of moving fast has been our downfall, because the best loved cities in the world are the ones that we built when we were only walking. They are what they are because of slow travel. And it turns out, this is interesting research that says that people will only tolerate a 1-hour journey, and that's 1/2 hour to their destination and 1/2 hour back. So a lot of these ancient cities were no more than 3 miles across. And that's true not just of the ancient cities, but early North American cities like Savannah were literally, you know, often less than 3 miles across, because they were constrained by the distance that people could travel on foot in a half an hour. And then when you forward to the mid-1900s and streetcars came on the scene, it offered people more speed so that they could get farther in that same amount of time. And it pushed the settlement area of a place like Kansas City out to about 10 miles across, because the streetcars got you there and back in that time that people tolerate. But the interesting thing about the streetcars is that they're basically still just moving pedestrians, that the settlement pattern remained very dense because it was very limited to the area of where the stops were. It was dense along the corridors and then along the stops, but there wasn't really much outside of that. And then 100 years later, everything just kind of got exploded with the car, because everyone was able to travel fast and much faster. And so that you could get to the center of Kansas City and out to the edge 20 miles away in that same half hour. So the metro area is just kind of spread out to about 40 miles across. And the interesting thing is that in order to maintain this, speed is essential. And that is dependent on road capacity. So when you have too many cars, you lose that road capacity and you lose those speeds. And what you end up with is a lot of really frustrated people that are spending more than an hour to get to their destination, and it's making them miserable, and it's making them want to live in a place that they can walk around and not be so dependent on their cars. So the quality of our city is directly related to the speed in which we travel through them. This environment is built for walkers, and it's one in which density is the best solution. It makes sense to have everything close together. It makes sense to have lots of stories on the building and to not have wide streets. But when you're traveling faster, 40 miles an hour, it's a very different set of priorities. The landscape blurs, the details don't matter, and you need to use your space not for people on foot, but for cars. You need to have wider roads, you need to have bigger turning radii, you need to have wider driveways, you need to have parking lots and parking garages. All of that space is taken up by the car. So this is why this diagram is so important. This is the inversion of the hierarchy that we've been using for the last 50 years when we make transportation policy decisions and development decisions. We have been putting the car at the top as the most important thing, but now it's time to tip it around because we need to give much more priority to the modes that are moving more slowly. Because if we don't flip that triangle over, we can build a very isolated fragment of an environment that looks like this, but we can't make a whole city and we can't make, or even a neighborhood with it. And if you've been to Memphis, you know that the downtown Main Street is a really lovely walking environment that they've put a lot of care and invested a lot of resources into. But once you step outside of that small little area, this is the southern end of it, and you turn around, this is what most of the downtown area looks like, and it's just a lot of empty spaces. So they're not taking that sort of pedestrian approach to the city, they just did it for one little street. And the reason why that walkable pattern breaks down is just because they have dedicated a lot of the space downtown to parking. And it turns out, you know, parking is the big challenge. It's like so many American cities, parking is like the monster that ate the town. When I visited Chattanooga last fall, I was really surprised to hear residents say that they had a real parking problem, that they didn't have enough parking, and that's what was preventing them for having more development in their downtown. And it seemed to me like everywhere I looked was a parking lot or a garage. So I just did this little diagram with Google Maps and outlined all the areas that were surface parking, and I showed it to him and said, look, you know, about 50% is just surface lots, and that doesn't even count the garages. You know, tell me how you have a parking problem. Have you counted up the number of spaces? And the more they talked about it, the more I realized that they have a lot of parking. They just don't have a lot of Doris Day parking. And Doris Day parking is when you drive your car right up to the curb in front of your destination and you get out, preferably in fur and heels, and you march with confidence to the front door and you walk in. And that is like this like winning the lottery and in the way that everybody wants to park. So it's a very satisfying experience in what we're trying to give everybody. And Cleveland is a great example of that. It's a really great place to park. I don't know whether you've been there, but it's really easy to find a spot, and it's very satisfying if what you want to do is park your car. It's got lots of surface parking lots, it's got lots of garages, and it's a really great place to drive, too, because the roads are wide, and they've signalized all the intersections, so you can just sort of keep going. But it's not a great place to be. You know, once you get there and you get out of your car, you scratch your head and say, well, you know, what's here? This is what it used to look like before they decided that everyone needed really convenient parking. And there are a few developers that have sort of pushed the bounds and created these little havens, as in Memphis, of a walkable environment. People come from the suburbs and they park their cars and then they walk up and down this one-block street. And it would be great to have more like this, but this developer is not allowed to do anymore because of their parking regulations. So parking is really preventing a lot of density and is preventing a lot of walkable environments. So it's something that's really important to keep in mind. And the real challenge is not so much the regulation, the problem is us. Because at heart, you know, we're all drivers. That's a universal experience for us, because right after we learn how to walk, we get the message from the adults around us that driving is the normal way to get around, that walking is for losers and buses are for poor people, and you know, this is, if you want to really be an American, just get a car and stop complaining. That's kind of the message that we get most of the time. So, you know, when we're making design decisions and policy decisions, we can really relate to that person who has to park the car and the person that wants to go fast. So it's hard for the other side of us to sort of stick up for the rights of the pedestrian. So speed has distorted our sense of the city, and it's distorted our sense of scale and what fits within a given area. Because if you walk that 2,000 feet on the left, you have a very different idea of what fits inside an area of 2,000 feet walk. it seems like there's room for a lot of stuff there. But if you spend that distance in the car, you're down that 2,000-foot stretch in probably about 2 minutes. And because you pass through it so fast, you feel like, well, there's not a lot of space there. And that's kind of the attitude that the planners in this community figured, well, we don't have room for much stuff there, so we can't fit much stuff in there. So as a result, they have maybe like 3 stores within that 2,000-foot range. And that's how the car has really distorted our sense of scale and how we need to sort of rethink speed. And I think we need to sort of talk more about proximity, because it's a much better word than density, because it talks about not just about people and housing, but it talks about all of the other stuff that needs to be within a small area. So this is a Latin term that's been used a lot over history, and it means solved by walking, or solved by practical experiment. So this is what I would like you to do. I would really love you to get an immediate understanding of how to design a walkable space by ditching your car. Just spend a week or a month without driving. Go through your weekly routine and without the aid of a vehicle, and just see what it's like. And do it long enough, and you'll see things that you've never noticed before. How little space you're given along the side of a busy road. The fact that the bus doesn't stop often, and it's not in a convenient location, and it's kind of difficult to get to. And you'll come to realize that the people that are designing the streets and building them and maintaining them probably don't ever spend any time walking around or using a wheelchair or pushing a baby stroller, or else they wouldn't have thought that the sidewalk is is just kind of a big tree planter. Or sending the guys from Public Works out to fill the big dirt patch where everyone walked around the street lamp. These are the decisions that are made by people that are not thinking like the users that they're serving, and this is a big problem. Who's designing the streets really matters. And you'll also find that this is generally a world that makes no sense if you're on foot. And it's a world that's really hard to care about because there's just not any there. And it's very difficult to be in this environment. For 50 years, we've taken really good care of the person behind the wheel. His path is extremely thought out. It's highly engineered. It's designed. But the person on foot, not much thought has gone into their experience. So now it's time to attend to the needs of people on foot by considering the environments they go through. Not just how they look, but what they feel like. And this is really hard work. And it takes a lot of cooperation, and it takes a lot of persistence. Because it's about placemaking. It's not about development projects. You need to talk to people who aren't like you, and you need to be patient, and you need to kind of bring them along, and you need to educate people, and you need to make concessions, but you just have to stop, just not give up, because it's really difficult. Because you have to shape and furnish a whole series of spaces. And the obvious ones are sidewalks, or boulevards, or plazas, or parks. These are kind of the things we kind of focus on as professional designers, you know. But there are all these other spaces that people occupy and move through on a daily basis that live in cities. And these need to be attended to too, because these are the places that bring them in contact with other people. And this is a really big and important contributor to mental health, because it's not just your relationship with your family and your friends that matter. It's the serendipitous encounters you have with people every day that make you feel like you belong somewhere. And the research on happiness is showing that a sense of belonging comes from these casual encounters. The design of cities can make those encounters much more likely. And social connections make communities much stronger, especially in times of disaster. It makes them more resilient, and it makes people a lot happier. So these face-to-face encounters are only possible when we get out of our cars. So I advise you to venture forth on 2 feet. And I urge you to explore the world one step at a time, and in the words of Alfred Barron, feel the elements, let the vital universal currents of the built environment play through you. And think like a pedestrian in everything you plan and everything you design, and make sure that your work serves the needs and enriches the experience of people, of someone that is moving through it at a walking pace. Let's call this the slow design movement. Convince your colleagues and your friends to join, because if we get enough people thinking like this, we can create the kind of places that provide what people really want, and that's health, convenience, companionship, and beauty. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Let's start with students. Let's start with lights, and then let's go with students after that. How many miles have you walked?
Well, actually, I have a treadmill walk desk, so a lot. Like, when I was sort of at my peak with this book, I was writing about a page every 10 miles. No, I walk a lot. I'm the kind of person that can't really stand still. I'm much more comfortable walking than standing, so I actually got a Fitbit pedometer, and I average about 5 to 10 miles a day. But it's really the best way to see cities. And I have 3 kids, and I have just dragged them across every city in the U.S. and a lot of European cities, and so they've learned to be good walkers too. As a matter of fact, they live in places where they don't need cars. So I mean, it's part of who I am and what I do. But I really think that that's the only way that you can learn about a place, is walking around in it. I actually spend a lot of time biking too, because you can. Biking is a really good pace for exploring cities, because you can just cover more ground, but you're still going slow enough to see things. And when I did the research for the book, I have a fold-up bike, and I would travel to a city, and I had sort of researched where the neighborhoods are, and I took a GPS tracking device, and I would just go from one neighborhood to the next, and I would just go up and down the streets, and a bicycle was just a perfect speed to do that at. And then I would look at my tracks at the end of the day and see where I had went, and there were a lot of squiggles. Yep.
Are many cities that have like old industrial areas, like the West Palms and Kansas City, are they trying to redevelop those with green spaces?
With green spaces?
Yeah, and like more pedestrian friendly, and trying to get reconnected, like Kansas City, they want to try to reconnect to the river.
Yeah. Those industrial areas are really popular because they have great old, what you call old bones, really interesting buildings that a lot of artists get drawn to, and can create places with a lot of character. Industrial buildings from the 1900s are a much more smaller scale than industrial buildings now, and they're often made of brick and have a kind of a warmth to them that the more contemporary buildings don't have. So they're really, really popular. And when you have a lot of intact buildings in a whole district, then they can be just real magnets for redevelopment. Toronto has done a lot with their industrial area. Every city, New York, Boston, it's kind of like the obvious place to start. The issue with a lot of those areas is resiliency. In this era of more extreme weather that we're in higher floodwaters, you have to do it in a very different way than we would have done it 20 years ago. You have to make sure that the floor level is elevated, and you have to use green infrastructure to make those public spaces able to withstand water. They can be the receiving areas for floodwater. So, it's just design is a really great tool to sort of make those places not only habitable but safe and environmentally beneficial. I kind of backed into writing. I was an English major in undergraduate, and when I went to design school, I just kind of, I thought, wow, great, I love to draw, and I love images. I'll just forget about that writing stuff, which was always kind of hard for me to begin with. But I found that that was unrealistic because you have to be able to communicate. And then I found that my writing, my liberal arts background and my reading that I had done in college was an incredible asset because I was able to kind of, I could read widely. I wasn't afraid of reading. And so that knowledge really informed the work that I was doing. And then I realized, well, I was kind of able to write. It's difficult for me. I'm not a fluid writer, but and I realize it's just hard. You just have to sit down and do it, or you just have to stand up and walk and do it. I've taken writing classes, and I realize that everyone has that problem. Everyone that writes a book or everyone that writes magazine articles, they'll say it's just hard, and you procrastinate and you procrastinate until your deadline is staring you in the face, and you can't procrastinate anymore, and then you just get it done.
It seems that you're writing and speaking a lot more now than perhaps designing.
Yes. It's kind of good and bad. It's good in that I can travel to places like this and see how people are doing things in a different context, and I can meet people with different perspectives, and that's really wonderful. The downside is that as a designer, the farther I get away from design, the more I feel like I don't have something to kind of bounce off the design ideas that I'm talking about. Because I think practitioners really understand what the potential for design is. The farther away you get from it, the more you're just kind of imagining it. But if you're really doing the actual work, then that you know every issue that's going to be a problem, and you know where the opportunities are. So it's kind of a mixed blessing. I'm actually starting to do a little bit more design work again, and it feels really good. Yeah.
You look at a lot of large cities, and I guess I was wondering, have you done any of this kind of work looking at cities maybe the size of Manhattan or a little smaller?
Yeah, it's a question that I get a lot, and it's always on my mind because I come from a small city. The town I live in is 40,000 people, and I have a real interest in the future of small cities because I think that there's so many of them in the country, and they're completely overlooked by people doing research and sort of the leaders in the field. And when I did Made for Walking, I was determined to include some small cities, and I have a few in there. But the problem is the transportation aspect of that small cities have trouble funding transit, and they're actually not usually interested in having a transit system because it's working pretty well in their minds. Like a place like Manhattan, you've got a nice little vibrant downtown, and you've got neighborhoods around it, and people can walk to them, so they figure, what's the big deal? Let's just leave it the way it is. But as you grow, and if you get bigger, you have two choices. You can either spread out farther and then have everybody driving, or you can build up your downtown with housing. But the challenge to do that is if you also try to put in parking, then you don't have room for enough housing. You can't get the density. And then if you don't also add transit at the same time, then you don't grow in that compact way. So a small city has to make a very definite and defined commitment to ease up on their parking regulations, to let developers build buildings without parking, and at the same time have a viable bus service. And that's a leap that a lot of small communities I haven't seen them willing to do that. Boulder, Colorado has kind of made some strides in that area. They've said that transit is really important, and they're allowing a lot more density downtown. And they have a height restriction, which creates a problem because there's only so much density you can get. But if they're willing to not have the parking regulations, they can get a lot more people in those buildings, and it can be more affordable. So I'd say that's a community that's really kind of struggling with this transit parking density issue at the small city scale, but I'm not seeing a lot of other ones. There are some communities, like suburban communities around metro areas, that have done a lot of infill, but they're already tied to a transit network that already exists. So I would consider those more like suburban retrofits than small cities like Manhattan. But if this is something that the community is really thinking about, the two things to keep in mind is transit and parking and density. And for a lot of places, that's kind of a big psychological leap. But that's why I'm here, to kind of get you guys thinking in this direction so that, the ideas spread. Oh, sorry.
One of the sides, you brought up Cleveland,
Mm-hmm.
and over with a mile of block downtown.
Yep.
You also said that Trump was going to see parking regulations.
Yep. Yep.
Could you go into more about the parking regulations?
Well, yeah, I mean, what he did was he got the city to block off the street, which was kind of a huge thing. But for every business he put in there, you needed to have so many parking spaces per square foot of retail. So that required a lot of parking areas, parking spaces. And they allowed him to put it outside of that little block, but that meant that there's like this ring of parking spaces around that little block. So he can't extend it because he's kind of used up the quotient of parking spaces around that block. So he can't extend it and can't continue it. So if another developer wanted to do it farther away with a ring of parking around it, they could do it, but they just can't sort of make that continuous urban fabric that I was talking about because of the parking regulations.
On the retailer side, a lot of retailers will have their own requirements for parking.
Yeah.
Are, I guess, some of those national chains, do you think that they can need like more detail on how much parking?
That's a good question. I think to them it's all about bodies, crossing the threshold. And they really don't care how people get there. They just want people to come in. So if there's a location where there's foot traffic going past, they'll locate their store there. And they have formulas for determining that. So they'll just analyze a location. If it's in a shopping mall, if it's in a lifestyle center, if it's in a downtown, then they're going to get people walking by, so they're not going to care about providing parking because they know their customers can get there. But if they're going into a location that they know the only way people are going to get there is in a car, and there's no other parking lots around there, there's no shared parking, then they're going to build a building that has a lot of parking spaces in it. So, but I think it's incumbent on the town to, plan a system where you get a lot of people walking, where you have shared parking spaces so that people can go and just park their car once and go to a lot of different stores, like a downtown environment. But only municipalities can make that happen unless you're a really big scale developer and you're building a whole lifestyle center or a whole development. Then you have the possibility of doing that, but then you end up with this great big kind of glorified mall. So you really want the municipality to kind of do that planning work and that infrastructure work. Do you have?
So, the federal government is greatly reducing their support for transit, and by, 25% or more incrementally. So many of these things, particularly the rail system, require federal government support. Have you thought about that? I mean, I can't
Well,
remember when we made it, St. Louis when we made it.
Yeah. Right, and who knows what's going to happen with the federals. I think we can count on the fact that not much will happen at the federal level, unfortunately. But I think that what's going to happen is that when the evidence is in on how much economic development is associated with those transit lines, I think that the people are going to start changing their minds about funding transit, because they're going to start to see that for every dollar you put into it, you get $10 back or whatever. So I think that it's going to have a life of its own. And whether or not it's the government the federal government that jumps in and says, okay, this is a good idea, or whether it's state governments or regional governments. I think a lot of the systems that have been built were not necessarily federal money. I think Portland in the beginning, or Oregon, built that system without. It was federal? Okay. Yeah, yeah. Right.
I just know the highway is subsidized by gas taxes. I remember just an article in Times, I think, about the revolt that's going on in Texas right now, because they're starting to get more toll roads, because they're taking consideration that this is what the highway system is created. So it just all starts to fall apart. You said state goes local, the problem is state local, has to do that.
Yeah.
At some point, everybody has to rise up and say, I can do that.
Right, right, and you know that takes a sort of a rational look at how we fund transportation and you know which dollars do you get more back from, you know, highway or rail, and it hasn't been kind of an objective lens that people have been looking at it through, because we're just so crazy about cars, and it's just kind of the way we've always done it, is build cities, because it build highways. It just takes you know, just looking at it in a different way. And I think that, you know, developers really want to build their projects around transit lines, because they know that that's what the market wants. So in this sense, the market, I've been in this business for a long time, and it's very exciting to me that this is becoming market driven. And that is really kind of what it's all about in this country, right? So, you know, once the market wants to go somewhere, you know, people are going to find out ways to get this done. One thing I did want to say about the small cities is that you don't really need transit. I mean, you don't need rails. You know, you can do a lot with a good bus system. And if you make the trick is to make the bus convenient. You know, there are a lot of people that feel like, you know, most people won't ride on buses, but that just hasn't been true. Bus ridership in a lot of parts of the country, Vermont has had, you know, our commuting bus riding rate has just tripled in the last 5 years, just because people have not wanted to spend the money on gas. It's just a more economical way to get around. So, you know, if there's a convenient bus, they take it. They don't have a problem sitting on the bus, and they're even finding that, you know, when you're on the bus, you can read and you can, you know, watch movies on your phone or whatever. So it's becoming a preferred mode if it's convenient. So bus systems are really cheap, car share, bike share. You know, you put all those things together and you can build a transit system for not much money. And that's really the only option for small cities.
There's one last question in the middle in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering, as a designer who champions walkability and good urbanism, what are some of the tools that you use in terms of communicating with clients who maybe have ambitions that are contrary to that idea?
Oh, how do I convince clients to do things differently?
What are the tools that you use to kind of sway clients to?
Well, I'm finding that videos on the internet are really effective. There's
Very empirical evidence.
Sorry?
Very empirical.
Empirical? Yeah. Well, clients, you know, you can give them a bunch of data and studies, but they don't react to that quite as much as something that's more gut level. I mean, a lot of my clients are municipalities. You know, I don't really work with private developers a lot. I'm working with nonprofits and municipalities, and they kind of come to this with these ideas of walkability, so they don't need as much convincing. Kind of what we need to do is educate the public in their communities to maybe go on a road diet or allow infill development. That's kind of what people are resistant to. And I find that internet videos are great because, you know, 4 minutes of their time can show them something that can be very convincing to them. There's a website called streetfilms.org, and they basically go around making really short videos about, you know, how to narrow your street, what a bike lane, a protected bike lane versus a regular bike lane looks like. They go to Copenhagen and they film, what that environment is like. So, it's just a great resource for, seeing what some of these urban design practices are like in other places. And then you can just give people those links and they can watch a 3-minute video and they can say, oh, I get it. It's just an easy way for give people access to information in a format that they're very comfortable with.
Okay, thank you, Julie, for coming.
Oh, thanks a lot.